Hello and welcome to the Tillage Edge with me, Michael Hennessy. This is your regular update for all your tillage news and advice. Last week, Teagasc hosted the Winter Crops Agronomy Update webinar, which covered the management needs of winter barley, winter wheat and oilseed rape for the coming weeks. Advisors from around the country highlighted crops at different growth stages and how best to manage these crops over the coming weeks. The webinar took questions live from attendees who tuned in, and these were answered by the expert panel. It's worth listening to this question and answer session again, as the information given was very relevant for the coming weeks. The first section covered winter barley agronomy, and Ciaran Collins, a tillage specialist in Teagasc, posed the questions to the panel. Ciaran first introduced the panel and then asked the first question around the management of conventional and hybrid barleys.
I think the only place to start, Mark Trimble posed a question, lads, in Kildalton. He had a 6-row hybrid on one side of him, and he had a 2-row conventional variety, Valerie, on his other side. And I suppose the question Mark had is, do we treat these varieties the same, or should management be different throughout the season? So I suppose, Richie, I might start with you. I know you've done some work in this area.
Yeah, we've compared the hybrids with the conventional 6 rows and 2 rows. And generally what we found that there's no great difference in terms of how you would approach managing them. You would basically take each variety, irrespective of what it is, whether it's a hybrid or a 6-row, and manage it in its own right. In terms of nitrogen, we've compared, looking at early and late nitrogen on the 2 rows and hybrid 6 rows and conventional 6 rows, and we couldn't find any consistent difference in terms of when you would start your nitrogen program on them. I know some of my colleagues, former student Rob Beattie and John Spink, would have looked at them in terms of fungicide inputs, and they would have generally found that there's no consistent difference between the hybrids and the non-hybrid varieties. So I suppose sum it all up, you take each variety on its own merits and treat it accordingly. I suppose one thing about the hybrids is that some of them tend to be a little bit earlier developing than, say, the conventional varieties.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thanks, Richie. So you treat each variety, as you say, on its own merits, its individual characteristics, rather than whether it's a hybrid or a conventional. And Richie, while I have you there, I suppose you did mention nitrogen, and I suppose it's a topic for debate every year, where people say, we see the first signs of growth there coming from the end of February, and when should I go with my first nitrogen? Maybe you might just comment there on that one.
Yeah, again, that's a question that we've done a lot of trials on over the years, and certainly if you put nitrogen on, say, in February compared to the middle of March, the crop that gets the nitrogen in February will always look better in March, April, and into May than the one that where you held off the nitrogen until March. But when it comes to yield, there's very little difference. So I think the advice would be that there's no mad panic to get out with nitrogen in February, and certainly not under the current conditions. Soil temperatures are after dropping considerably the last few days, and it's quite a wet weekend forecast. So I wouldn't be in any rush out, but towards the end of February, early March, that's probably when you need to start thinking about nitrogen, particularly on barley.
Okay, perfect. Thanks, Richie. And I suppose, Michael, maybe just to come to you, based maybe a little bit further south, I might just ask maybe just to comment on your view of how winter barley is looking. Michael, was establishment good? Has it wintered well, maybe?
Yeah, for the most part it has, Ciaran. The earlier sowing crops are probably that bit more advanced than the later sowing crops. I know down here, the later it went into October, conditions were a bit heavier and harder going. So, but for the most part, crops are looking well. There's no hunger appearing yet in any crops. We've seen over the years that when you hit February, you get the first yellows start coming. But I always tend to look at the overlaps of where the drill would overlap on headlands, and they're the first places you'll see for that kind of nitrogen deficiency to start coming up. But it's not showing yet, and nor is there showing manganese. In fairness, crops are looking good. Can I just come to Richie's point there with the nitrogen timing? I'd have a lot of farmers down here that would be, very much promoters of the early nitrogen. But last year, we had a wet February, so there was very little opportunity to get out with early nitrogen. And a lot of nitrogen didn't go out on crops until March. And it made no difference at all to the yields of barley. We'd still some very, very good yields of barley last year. So that early nitrogen timing, it brings out a great green in the crop in early March. But that's about as much as it ever does in my book. Now, unless you have an absolutely struggling crop that you could have tiller debt or something like that. We get it down here on the coastal areas where you have hard wind coming in off the sea, that you could have tillers in trouble. Like that probably would be a scenario that where earlier small bit of nitrogen would have an effect. But to remember too, like Michael, crop isn't going to take a lot of nitrogen early, like so.
Yeah, very, very sensible advice there. Shay, if I can turn to you, we saw John Brophy was looking at weed control there. I think in general, I suppose most people got a chance to get some herbicide out on winter barley this year. We've got a question here. In cold conditions, what are the best broadleaf products to use? Maybe you might answer that one, and maybe what people might use in terms of tidy up this spring, Shay.
Yeah, it's a very good question, Ciaran, because I know there are guys out there who are kind of maybe struggling with some weeds that have got through the system. And maybe some guys didn't even get to spray prior to Christmas, and they might have a nice bank of weeds there in them. It's a kind of a double-edged sword. I mean, if you're trying to control weeds in cold conditions, weeds aren't actively growing, so you don't tend to get as good a control with your herbicides as you do when the weeds are actively growing. So if you're looking at, depends on the weed spectrum you have, I suppose. If you're looking at, say, the likes of annual meadowgrass, I mean, there's very little control that you're going to achieve at this stage with the products that are there. I mean, if you look at your typical grass weed products that you're going to use, the kind of pendimethalin type products, at this stage, annual meadowgrass is going to be pretty strong and probably tillering at this stage. So while you might get some suppression, or even with cloud-tolerant, you might get some suppression, you're probably not going to get full control. So really and truly what you're looking at now for the vast majority of weeds that are there, say the problem weeds, say something like grounds or something that's come through, are your spring type herbicides. So you're looking at likes of your Cameo Max type products or that. Other products that might be you're looking at mainly your spring type products there that are going to control your weeds for you. The one product I suppose that probably does work a little bit better in cooler conditions like is Zypar. Which probably will work that little bit better in cooler conditions. But again, it's about tailoring your product to the weed that's there. Figure out what weeds you need to control and then decide what strategy you need to go with. And if that means that you're using those spring type SU herbicides, then you may wait until you get a bit of growth and a bit of kind conditions to apply.
Okay, thanks, Shay. And just before we leave winter barley, and we will have time at the end maybe to come back to, I have a few more questions here that we didn't get to, but Shay, just as you're on that topic, I suppose something that crops up every year is tank mixing in the spring. You might have a tidy up on weeds, you might have growth regulator, maybe fungicide, you might just maybe a bit of advice on that one.
Yeah, it always is a bit of a struggle, and there's a bit of a it can take an extra pass, I think, now is kind of the way I'm looking at it now. If you look at where some crops are at the moment, they might need trace elements, they might need a PGR in order maybe to manipulate tillers, they might need a tidy up of herbicides, and they may also need a fungicide in March as well if you have a lot of net blotch or wrinkle or something like that in the crop. Quite often guys try to put all that into one tank. And I suppose you have to look at weather conditions we generally get in March. We can get large fluctuations in temperatures, day and nighttime temperatures in March. And that's a stress on the crop on its own. So if we throw in a whole heap of chemistry, 5, 6, 7-way mixes in on top of that crop that might already be stressed, you're going to stress it even more. And we've seen that in the last couple of years, whereby due to no other fault other than time pressures, guys were having to combine all these big tank mixes. They do stress the crop, and they can stress the crop if you get the wrong conditions at the wrong time. So what you'll see, if any of you, and it's online at the moment, the cost returns booklet for this year. What we've done in that this year, Ciaran, is we've actually added in another pass in the cost returns booklet just to kind of mirror that, whereby that kind of March, April, early April kind of control, where you're trying to control a couple of different things in the crop. We've kind of split those into 2 passes. So you might go with a PGR or something like that early on where you're trying to manipulate tillers, then come back in with a fungicide or a herbicide or whatever it is. And Y nodes has to come in there as well.
Okay.
You know?
The next series of questions looks at managing winter oilseed rape for the coming weeks. Ciaran first asked a question around green area index in oilseed rape.
And Shay, maybe I might throw this one to you. Firstly, where do you get the app? And maybe just a very brief description. Veronica did it very well there, but just a summary of how to use it and the importance of the GAI, Shay.
Yeah, to start off with, Ciaran, it's an app developed in the UK by in conjunction with BASF. It's available for iPhone users only. It's not available on the Google Play Store as far as I know. But if you go into a website there and just Google green area index, you'll be able to calculate it off the BASF website, or there are other websites there as well. So you'll be able to calculate it off that, input your photographs into it, and away you go. But it's very handy if you have an iPhone that you can do it there in the field. Like Veronica says there, it gives you a good measure then of how much leaf is in the field and critically how much nitrogen is in the field. So as we know, oilseed rape stores the nitrogen in its leaves. So once those leaves are removed, as you could see in Martin's picture there, you're removing nitrogen. So you're going to have to top that up again. So that's kind of the importance of it. It kind of gives you a good starting point for where you are at the moment, and it gives you a target as to where you need to go at flowering at 3.5 GAI. So it's a measure of as Veronica says, there's a measure of the area of leaf on a meter square at that time.
Okay, thanks, Shay. A useful one that I kind of use is a GAI of 1 is approximately 50% ground cover. I suppose it kind of gives you an idea, but the app is obviously very, very useful. There's a question here in relation to what's the panel's views on maybe using urea compared to nitrogen for the early application on oilseed rape. Maybe Michael, I might put that one to you.
Yeah, I wouldn't see a big issue, Ciaran, especially if you've conditions that are conjunctive to using urea. The one reservation I would have is if you need to put on a lot of sulfur. That's why we typically went with ASN, and that you'd front loaded your sulfur on. And I think that when it comes to urea products, that I think some of the best of them are offering about 7 to 8% sulfur. So you're not going to get enough sulfur there if sulfur is your requirement. I suppose that would be my really only reservation. But as regards to nitrogen source, Ciaran, I wouldn't see why there would be an issue.
Okay. And Richie, I might come to you just on that sulfur one. We have a question here. If the GI is 1.5, say, or 2, when would the sulfur go on? And maybe how would delaying it affect nutrient use efficiency?
Well, I suppose, first of all, if the crop is that advanced, it will have been getting sulfur anyway, and soils obviously will, unless you're on a very sandy soil, soils will be contributing quite a bit of sulfur to the crop. But I suppose in that case, when you're going with your first split, you would be looking at something like ASN to get on as much of the sulfur in your first nitrogen as possible. But I would be timing the application regarding nitrogen rather than sulfur. So when the crop actually needs the nitrogen rather than the sulfur. In terms of how it affects NUE, that the crop uses sulfur with nitrogen. So if it doesn't need the nitrogen early, it's not going to need the sulfur early either. So as I say, the two of them are sort of interlinked in the plant and how the plant metabolizes. So it's going to use the sulfur with the nitrogen, and so when it needs the nitrogen, it'll need the sulfur as well.
Okay. Thanks very much, Richie. And can I just get on this one? Not going to ask you what levels of nitrogen we'd have in the soil, but this might be for people that don't have oilseed rape a relevant question as well, in terms of what are the factors maybe that we'd be looking at in terms of soil nitrogen and what we could expect this spring.
Yeah, well, sure. I suppose the first thing that sort of dictates how much nitrogen a crop is going to get from the soil is the soil type. So heavier soils will tend to give more than light sandy soils. Next most important thing is organic matter. Higher organic matter soils. So soils that are near grass are obviously going to give you a lot more nitrogen than soils that have been cultivated for many years. And then I suppose in terms of climate, it's the amount of rain over winter. So if you have a lot of rain over the winter period on winter crops, winter sown area, you're going to lose a certain amount of the nitrogen that would have been in the soil. this winter is sort of part of December was higher rainfall than normal, if I remember correctly, but the rest of the months have been sort of around about normal. So I'd be expecting sort of normal levels of soil nitrogen coming from the crop. So I wouldn't be adding more nitrogen because I thought it was going to be less nitrogen. That could all change in the next couple of weeks, but at the minute that would be what we would be thinking.
Okay, thanks, Richie. I might just do a final one on oilseed rape for the time being. Shay, in relation, there's a question here in relation to growth regulation of oilseed rape. You know, obviously those grazed crops with low GEIs wouldn't receive a growth regulator, but Shay, what would your advice be there, and maybe the benefits of it?
Yeah, again, Ciaran, it comes back to assessing your crop that's there in front of you and making decisions on that. If you have a very large canopy, so something like that's a GAI of 2, and you put a whole lot of nitrogen onto that, that's your first problem. You're not going to be able to control that canopy. So nitrogen is probably the first place you start off with, and when you actually time that nitrogen in terms of manipulating that canopy and whether you need growth regulation or not. So that's the first place to start with. After that, if you have to try and manipulate canopies, then you're looking at the fungicide type. So you have something like with tebuconazole or something like that in it, will have some growth regulatory effect, as will metconazole. And there's a new product out there this year from BSF called Teagasc, which is a mixture of metconazole and mepiquat chloride, which also gives a growth regulatory effect. And I suppose the problem with big, large canopies, as Martin has mentioned them earlier on, but the other problem that can happen is you can start getting leaning or lodging, whereby you get a kink in the stem and the stem starts to lean over. Once stems start to do that, you can start to get yield loss very, very quickly. And just to kind of give you an idea, if you have a crop that's kind of half leaned over, say at a 40-45 degree angle or something like that, or at a 90-degree angle, you get 45-50% of a yield loss straight away. So that's before the crop ever gets to harvest, because it's just not filling the pods. But I would start, before people start putting out growth regulatory fungicides, I'd be starting with my nitrogen strategy and seeing where that goes first. And I just wanted to mention there as well, and Martin mentioned it as well, about heavily grazed crops. No point putting out nitrogen on those crops and not moving off the pigeons. You have to control the pigeons as well, because if you put out the nitrogen and you grow more leaf, the pigeons are just going to stay grazing off that leaf. So you have to move off those pigeons as well.
This final section discusses questions around winter wheat, and Ciaran first asked a question around grass weeds in winter wheat.
Jimmy Staples is the only panelist we haven't heard from yet. So Jimmy, I'm going to bring you in there straight away. I suppose Phelan did a very good summary there, and I suppose focused on the IPM aspect. And I suppose if we look at the pyramid, the chemical is almost the last resort. But maybe from your experience on the ECT program, maybe you might share something in relation to how IPM dovetails with our chemical control, Jimmy, in relation to maybe sterile brome to start with.
Yeah, well, I suppose you're talking about sterile brome, we're talking about an autumn germinating grass weed. So you need to understand a bit about it. So it's going to germinate mostly from August, September, and early October. So first thing you're thinking is you're looking at pushing back your sowing dates. You push back your sowing dates, and then you're looking at coming in with your pre-emerge herbicide. Pre-emerge is always going to give you better control than your post-emerge alone, but following that up then with an autumn post-emerge as well is going to give you better control. If we just talk about the likes of some of the, say, Firebird, which would be used an awful lot for sterile brome control. Like if you look at the results and what we're seeing in the weed screen, Firebird on its own pre-emerge will give you some control, but you'll always get better control when you follow up with a post-emerge. Really, you want to be looking at using Firebird will give you about 120 grams of flufenicate, but it alone isn't going to give you enough control. You need to be looking at doubling that. Really, you need to be looking at 240 grams of flufenicate. So you're looking at using 0.6 of something like Naceto or something along those lines to give you better control. Bayer have new products coming along. Phelan mentioned the Firebird Met, which will be available next autumn. Looking at the results there, we got excellent control. stop the brome in its tracks, and there was very little brome came through later in the autumn. Even now in the last week of January, first week of February, there's very little brome in that situation, and where you'd have crop competition as well, which is obviously something that's not there in that trial. You're looking at a very, very good control with that type of a product. So but again, IPM is crucial. Knowing what weeds you have, understanding the weed, knowing its weaknesses, and then using your chemicals, targeting your chemicals. That's really what you want to be doing.
Okay, thanks, Jimmy. Just as we're on the sterile brome, Michael, I noticed you had a strip of sterile brome down near a ditch there in Cork. Is there anything from an IPM perspective maybe there that we could do? Non-chemical option, maybe like arable margins, or?
Yeah, it is an option. If people were at the last open day in Oak Park, they would have seen where the cocksfoot margins were put in, and it was almost a direct stop where the sterile brome stopped and the cocksfoot took on. So it definitely is an option, Ciaran, especially when we're going into the future with newer environmental measures and stuff. It may be something that people can consider, because what you must remember is like that strip we saw in the picture there, like that's an extremely unproductive strip. Do you know what I mean? It looks like almost 40% brome. It's going to have an awful effect on the yield. So a strip like that could be much better off in an arable margin, as opposed to trying to manage a weed inside it.
Okay, yeah, and as you say, it stops it spreading out into the rest of the field. Yeah. Just a reminder, lads, we still have a few minutes to go. If you have any questions, don't forget to submit them there in the Q&A tab. Shay, if I could come to you, Ivan spoke about the management of maybe later sown or thinner crops there. Just in terms of those management tips, I suppose fertilizer, Shay, is probably one of the key ones this spring.
Yeah, he's right, Ciaran. I mean, basically what you're trying to do is you're trying to get those crops to catch up to where they should really be at this stage. And tiller manipulation, tiller development, if you can see from Ivan's clip there, is basically what he's talking about. Trying to promote those tillers to grow and to produce the heads. When we still need to get to, somewhere around 700-800 heads per square meter by harvest time. So we want to kind of get as many of those as we possibly can. So we have to try and promote those tillers to get them to grow, albeit wheat has a better capacity to compensate for low head numbers than barley does. But at the same time, we still need to try and promote them. So Ivan's right there. If we can stimulate them by early nitrogen, provided of course soil temperatures are good enough. And he showed the photograph there of the thermometer in the ground where it was 6-7 degrees. You need those sort of temperatures to have any sort of uptake of nitrogen. Anything above 4 degrees, crops are growing, but certainly the higher the temperatures, the better. And you'll notice from what Ivan was talking about there, he wasn't loading on a lot of nitrogen early on, because the capacity of the crop there to utilize that nitrogen at this time of the year just isn't there. So from that point of view, it was a little and often. So he was looking at splitting that first typical application of about 40 to 50 kilos of nitrogen. So he was splitting it in two. So he was putting out a small bit to kind of get the crop to start off. And then he was finishing off probably by about growth stage 30 to get that first split, if you like, back on track. The other thing he was looking at there as well is manipulation with PGRs. And again, that's about strengthening the crop at the base, making sure that those tillers, that apical dominance of that main shoot is held back, and you have the side tillers then get the opportunity of coming through and growing. So you're trying to make sure that that early PGR is 2 rows, trying to strengthen the base of the crop, but also try to promote those side tillers to come on as well.
Okay, thanks, Shay. And I know, Richie, you've looked at it before, but wheat, if plants are evenly distributed, we can actually go down to quite low plant counts and still have viable crops.
That's correct, Ciaran. I suppose wheat is quite different to barley. In barley, we know high head number is important. In wheat, the crop can make up in 2 ways, either by having more heads or by having more grains in each head. And where you get lower populations, what tends to happen is the crop makes up the difference by putting more grains into the head. So it's not quite as important to get a high head number in wheat as it is in barley. There's a second mechanism that kicks in later in the season.
Okay, thanks, Richie. And Jimmy, back to you. A question from Sean here. Any observations on the extent of blackgrass in Ireland now?
Yeah, I was doing a bit of tried to do a bit of research on it there over the autumn time and get a bit of input from the trade and from the department and from the Teagasc advisors there. To the best of our knowledge, there's probably around 100 cases of blackgrass in the country now at the moment, but like it's hard to get an accurate number on it when farmers are not, you know, they don't want to come forward and say, look, and hold their hand up for whatever reason it may be, and a lot of them are justifiable. But so we're not 100% sure, but that's where it looks at the moment. And the worrying thing is that's an increase on last year, and it's an increase on the year before as well. So it seems to be going in the wrong direction. It's a worrying trend, I suppose. Yeah.
Okay, and if any farmers concerned, Jimmy, what steps should they take? Maybe contact their local advisor or?
Yeah, contact their local advisor. Feel free to contact me. Like, it can be anonymously if they want. Like, there should be no pressure on anybody to put their name or whatever. Like, but feel free to give me a shout or give their local advisor a shout, whoever it might be. There's always ways and means of solving the issue or getting on top of it. Like, but acting quickly and acting early is the key thing, you know. Because if it gets a hold, it's very, very difficult to get on top of.
Yeah, absolutely. So early identification and early control and taking all IPM measures, I suppose, Jimmy, is the key message, isn't it?
That was a great roundup of the questions asked and answered at the Winter Crops Agronomy Update webinar last week. A huge thanks to Ciaran Collins, the panel, and all the advisors for running such a successful webinar. If you'd like to see the video of the entire webinar, log on to Teagasc Crops YouTube page. So that's it for the Tillage Edge this week, and don't forget the final part of the Teagasc Tillage Month continues next week with the Malt and Barley Conference on Tuesday, February the 23rd at 11:30 a.m. For more details, go to www.teagasc.ie/Tillage Month. Don't forget, if you like this podcast, then recommend it to a friend or colleague, and as always, rate, review and subscribe on Apple Podcast or Spotify so you never miss an episode. And for more farming news, go to teagasc.ie. I'm Michael Hennessy. Thanks for listening, and I'll be back next week with more tillage news and advice.